The house of God, the weight of shadows. The first thing people noticed was the silence. Sacred Heart Seminary, perched on the edge of the Illinois prairie, had always carried with it a soundscape as constant as the rising sun. The toll of the chapel, bell echoing across the flat fields, the rhythmic chant of young voices reciting Latin prayers, the creak of wagon wheels on the gravel road leading to its iron gates. But beginning in the winter of 1847, the soundscape began to change. Whispers slipped into the stillness. Voices were swallowed by stone walls, and the bell, once a clarion of holy devotion, began to toll in ways that seemed more like warnings. To outsiders, the seminary was a triumph. Its Gothic spires rose like sharpened fingers toward the Midwestern sky, brick walls imported from the finest kilns in Chicago, windows of stained glass glowing ruby and sapphire at dawn and dusk. The building stood defiant on the prairie, a monument to faith in a land more accustomed to barns than to cathedrals. But to those who crossed its threshold, the grandeur concealed something darker. The air itself seemed charged, as if the very stones remembered pain. In the spring of 1848, Margaret Connolly, Chicago's wealthiest Catholic widow, traveled by carriage to Sacred Heart to visit the institution she had personally endowed with $8,000, more than the worth of some towns. Her carriage arrived at dusk. She expected to be greeted by laughter, by the fervent energy of seminarians rushing between classes. Instead, she stepped into a world where shadows moved differently. Candles flickered in the chapel, though it was far from evening prayer, and the corridors carried the heavy musk of damp wool and old incense, as if the building had been fasting along with its occupants. Margaret never forgot the first student she spoke to that evening. A pale young man with sunken eyes, his cassock loose on his thinning frame, answered her greeting with a half-smile. His voice trembled when she asked how many students now lived within the walls. 9, madam, he said, glancing nervously toward the high staircase where Father Walsh's shadow loomed. Margaret, confused, recalled that she had funded the seminary for at least 24 students. Walsh, with his imposing height and silver beard, assured her that the others had been called to missions where God's need was greatest. His tone left no room for questions. That night, Margaret returned to Chicago uneasy, sensing she had seen only the surface of something vast and hidden. Within the year, she would be dead of sudden illness, her fortune redirected through executors, chosen by the very men who ruled Sacred Heart. The era of fear to understand what happened at Sacred Heart Seminary. You must understand America in the 1840s. Irish immigrants were flooding into cities, fleeing famine, carrying their rosaries like lifelines. They found themselves branded as intruders. Anti-Catholic riots tore through neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. Priests were tarred and feathered in daylight. Convents were set ablaze by Protestant mobs convinced that Catholicism was a foreign contagion. The church knew survival depended on one thing: producing American-born priests who could pass as respectable. And so, Sacred Heart was built, an oasis in Illinois where boys of wealth and promise would be molded into clergy, strong enough to withstand suspicion and proud enough to lead. It should have been a fortress of learning, a safeguard for faith. But isolation is a double-edged sword. 40 miles from Chicago, surrounded by 400 acres of prairie, Sacred Heart was too far for oversight, too far for questions to be answered quickly, and far too convenient for secrets to be buried. It was in this perfect crucible of fear, faith, and distance that the first disappearance occurred. Michael Brennan. Michael Brennan was the kind of son immigrant parents dreamed of. 22 years. Old, fluent in Latin, broad-shouldered from years of helping in his family's grocery business, and pious enough to spend long evenings with his rosary in hand. His family had scrimped and saved 5 years' worth of profits to send him to Sacred Heart, hoping he would rise through the church and bring their family honor. On February 13, 1848, Michael was summoned to Father Walsh's office during one of the worst snowstorms Illinois had seen in years. Students later recalled watching him walk down the corridor, leather portfolio tucked under his arm, his boots crunching against the stone floor. That was the last time any of them saw him alive. The next morning, Walsh stood at the pulpit, his voice carrying sorrow as he explained that Michael had answered God's sudden call to minister to cholera victims near the Iowa border. A noble sacrifice, Walsh said, a sign of true priestly devotion. The students murmured prayers for his safety, though some noticed the heavy winter coat still hanging in their dormitory wardrobe. Michael's gloves, his boots, his silver rosary, all left behind, and Joseph Kennedy, Michael's closest friend, knew the story was a lie. He had sat beside Michael only hours earlier, listening as his friend spoke excitedly about advanced theology lessons, about his joy in serving God. Michael had made no mention of leaving, no hint of restlessness. When Joseph dared question Walsh, privately, asking why Michael's coat remained behind, he was punished. Locked in the damp basement chapel for a week of prayerful reflection, Joseph endured nights where the stone walls wept with moisture, where shadows quivered against the candlelight. And it was there, underground, that he first heard the wagons. At 2 a.m, hoofbeats thudded above the chamber, voices whispered in Irish accents. Lantern light slipped through the grime-stained window. Joseph pressed his face to the glass just in time to see a bundle, long, heavy, wrapped in cloth, lifted by Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, into the back of a covered wagon. They moved it, not like cargo, but like something fragile, something once alive. The wagon creaked into the darkness toward Springfield. The chapel grew silent. Joseph pressed his rosary into his palm until it cut his skin, praying not for his own salvation, but for his friend's lost soul. The second vanishing march brought thaw and with it another loss. Thomas Gallagher, the gentle son of a Milwaukee brewer, vanished after a late-night summons to Walsh's office. The priest claimed Thomas had suffered a spiritual crisis and fled to a monastery in Wisconsin for penitence. But his rosary, gift carved by his dying mother, remained carefully placed on his desk. His letter to his sister stopped mid-sentence. His $50 savings remained untouched in the priest's safe. By Christmas that year, 7 students were gone, each disappearance cloaked in elaborate explanation, each body erased as if the prairie itself had swallowed them whole. And still, families received letters in Father Walsh's handwriting, assuring them their sons were safe, learning, thriving. But outside in the town of Millfield, farmers whispered. Samuel Morrison, who owned the land adjacent to Sacred Heart, found strange belongings. Near his fence line, a prayer book, a crucifix, spectacles no longer worn. At night he saw wagons moving slowly, wheels muffled with cloth, always bound for the road that led away from Chicago. The unraveling by 1849, unease had curdled into dread. Joseph Kennedy could no longer ignore the patterns. Disappearances always happened in storms, always followed late-night meetings in Walsh's office. The priests grew richer, silk vestments, gold watches, fine horses, while the students grew fewer, thinner, quieter. Even Brother McManus, the jittery layman who shadowed the priests, seemed unable to meet anyone's eyes when asked about the missing. But it was James O'Malley, a student from Detroit, who would force the shadows into the light. Unlike the others, James had powerful family connections, a wealthy merchant father and an uncle high in the church hierarchy. He began keeping records, dates, patterns, financial discrepancies. Letters written in code that he found hidden beneath the library floorboards. One entry chilled him. The latest shipment included 2 prime specimens. The German boy fetched premium price for coal operations. The Irish lad sold to Wisconsin, lumber interests. Both transactions completed without complication. It was no longer just disappearance. It was commerce. James understood then that Sacred Heart Seminary was no seminary at all. It was a marketplace. And the young men who walked through its gates, hopeful and devout, were not students. They were stock. And one winter night, when Father Walsh's voice summoned James himself to the office, he knew the time had come. Either he would join the missing, or discover what truly lay beneath the stones of Sacred Heart, the whispering walls. The night James O'Malley was summoned to Father Walsh's office. The seminary corridors seemed longer than usual, the shadows thicker. The lamplight trembled across the stone walls as if the building itself were shivering. James moved slowly, his boots clicking against the flagstones, each step echoing too loudly in the silence. Behind him, the chapel bell tolled 9 times, and then the sound dissolved into a stillness so absolute it felt unnatural. Inside the office, Walsh no longer looked like a priest. The silver beard still framed his face, the eyes still pierced, like steel, but something had slipped. The way he leaned back in his chair with the posture of a man guarding territory, not tending to a soul. Flanking him, Rector Murphy and Dean O'Brien stood silent, like sentinels. Their hands rested on the edges of Walsh's desk, too deliberately placed as if ready to act. Walsh's voice carried no warmth, no pastoral cadence. It was the voice of a broker, a man measuring profit against risk. "You've been asking questions," he said, his accent roughened by something not scholarly, but street-born. "Questions that make men disappear." James met his eyes and, for the first time, saw not a priest but a predator. The offer Walsh leaned forward, his gold watch glinting in the candlelight. "You've a clever mind, lad. Dangerous, yes, but useful. A family with wealth, an uncle in the church. We could use someone like you. Point us to families rich enough to pay tuition, naive enough not to ask too many questions when their sons go missing. In return, you'll finish your studies, live your priesthood, and never want for coin." The words struck James like cold water. Walsh was offering him complicity, a seat at the table where human souls were priced like livestock. "And if I refuse?" James asked. O'Brien's hand shifted. His fingers tapped the desk twice, a signal James couldn't quite decode. Murphy's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, though it had no humor in it. Walsh's answer was calm, chilling. "Then you'll join your classmates in the fields beyond these walls, buried where even God forgets to look for." A heartbeat James considered feigning agreement, but he saw it in Walsh's eyes. The man would never trust him. Compliance was only a stay of execution, so James played his only card. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "My uncle is Father Patrick O'Malley of Detroit," he said. "If I disappear, it will not be quiet. Letters will fly to bishops, then to Rome. You won't escape the questions." For the first time, Walsh's mask flickered. The room held its breath. Then Walsh leaned back, dismissive, but James caught the glint of calculation in his eyes. "You've bought yourself time," Walsh said. "But time is a debt, and debts are always collected." James left the office with his pulse hammering in his ears. He knew now he was marked. Watching eyes. From that night forward, James was never alone. Brother McManus, the jittery lay brother, shadowed him constantly. In the chapel, in the library, even at meals, McManus hovered, scribbling notes in a small, leather-bound journal, his eyes darting like a man who lived in constant fear. The surveillance grew suffocating. James would return to his dormitory to find his belongings subtly disturbed. A book shifted, a drawer left slightly ajar, his papers rifled through. Once, he found his mattress seam unpicked, then clumsily restitched. Someone was searching for the records he had begun to compile, and always, the nights. James woke more than once to the faint smell of tobacco in his room, though he himself did not smoke. Footprints in the dust near his bed confirmed what he feared. Someone was entering. While he slept, the seminary itself seemed to collude in the menace. The walls groaned at odd hours. The pipes clattered though no water ran. And in the dead of night, James swore he heard voices murmuring just beyond the chapel walls. He began to understand why the students had started calling it the Whispering House. Patterns of absence. Determined to survive, James deepened his secret investigation. He noted the patterns. Disappearances always followed private summonses to Walsh's office. Always on stormy nights when outside travel was impossible. Always cloaked in pious explanations, missionary calls, spiritual crises, transfers. But what alarmed him most were the priest's finances. Despite the seminary's modest tuition fees, Walsh now wore silks, Murphy flaunted gold spectacles, and O'Brien returned from Chicago with fine leather gloves and a stallion fit for nobility. James, versed in ledgers through his father's business, calculated that Sacred Heart's visible income could not sustain such luxuries. The missing money, thousands of dollars, was coming from somewhere else. Then, in December 1849, James found the proof. The hidden cash. The discovery was accidental. While pacing the library late at night, James noticed a floorboard near the wall was looser than the rest. Kneeling, he pressed it. The board shifted, revealing a compartment beneath. Inside lay a stack of letters, folded and bound with string, their pages stained with candle smoke and damp. The handwriting varied, but the tone was consistent, businesslike, coded, cold. Words like specimens and deliveries and prime quality. One letter chilled him to the marrow. 2 prime specimens arrived. 1 German boy, strong and literate, ideal for overseeing miners. The Irish lad sold separately to lumber camps. Both transactions concluded. Payment received. James felt the bile rise in his throat. These were his classmates. These were souls, bought and sold like cattle. The letters confirmed everything. Sacred Heart was not a seminary. It was a supply hub in a trafficking network that stretched across states. The priests were not clergy at all, but criminals wearing cassocks like wolves wearing fleece. James slipped the letters back beneath the floorboards, his hands trembling. He knew then, if he was to survive, he had to find a way to expose the truth to someone beyond Walsh's reach. The silent devotions. Every 2 weeks, the priest announced a period of private devotion. Students were confined to their dormitories from dusk to dawn under threat of severe punishment. No one was allowed to roam, no one permitted to question. James, suspicious, stayed awake one February night, watching from his dormitory window. Outside, lanterns bobbed between the outbuildings. He heard the creak of wagons, the muffled shouts of men hauling heavy burdens. From the direction of the old barn came the scrape of wood against stone, as though something large were being lowered into a hidden place. And then, the sound that would never leave him, the muffled cry of a human voice, quickly silenced. James pressed his forehead to the glass, his breath fogging the pain. His hands shook as he wrote the date and details in his ledger, the secret below. The following week, under the cover of evening prayer, James slipped into the basement. What he found was worse than his darkest suspicions. Beneath the chapel, the stone corridors branched into chambers newly dug, their walls raw with shovel marks, rooms filled with crates, ledgers bound in calfskin, maps marked with routes stretching from Illinois to Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana. And in one chamber, a sight that nearly broke him, rows of clothing neatly stacked, cassocks, boots, rosaries. He recognized a pair of spectacles belonging to Heinrich Weber, gone these many months. A silver crucifix that had once hung from Thomas Gallagher's neck. Each item was evidence, stripped from a vanished life. James barely had time to process the horror before footsteps echoed down the corridor. Walsh's voice, low and muttering, drifted closer. James extinguished his candle and ducked behind a stack of crates, his heart battering his ribs. The lantern light filled the chamber. Walsh entered, rifling through the papers James had just examined. His muttering turned to curses as if he sensed disturbance. He stepped within feet of James's hiding place, the smell of tobacco and sweat heavy in the air. For a moment, James thought the priest would turn, would catch him crouched there. But after a tense eternity, Walsh relit his lantern, gathered a handful of documents, and left. James waited another hour before slipping out, every nerve aflame. The first spark of hope. James knew then he couldn't delay. He had to reach someone powerful enough to stop this, and fate delivered the first spark of hope. News that a Vatican inspector, Bishop Giovanni Montini, had been sent to America to investigate seminaries. His arrival was rumored but unannounced, the kind of oversight Sacred Heart had never endured. If James could contact him, he might expose everything. But letters were intercepted, conversations overheard. He needed a code, something only a trained theologian would recognize. So he wrote, in careful Latin, a request for guidance on the duties of students when confronted with authority that violates canon law. To a casual reader, harmless theology. To Montini, it would signal rot in the foundation. Now all James had to do was get it out of Sacred Heart without Walsh knowing. And for that, he would need help. From someone who might betray him the moment fear outweighed loyalty. On a cold March evening, James approached Samuel Morrison, the neighboring farmer who had long whispered of wagons and strange cries. Under the thin moonlight, James pressed the letter into the farmer's hand. "If I don't live to see Easter," James said, "make sure this reaches Chicago. It may save not only me but every boy still breathing inside those walls." Morrison swallowed, his weathered face pale. "Son, if what you're saying is true, there's more than boys in danger. There's an empire behind those priests, and they'll kill us both if they find out." James looked back at the looming spires of Sacred Heart, black against the horizon. "They already know," he whispered. "It's just a question of when." The bishop in the shadows. The first sign that Bishop Giovanni Montini was near came not from church bells, but from the silence of the priests themselves. For weeks, Father, Walsh had strutted about the seminary grounds in silk vestments and a pocket watch that gleamed like a crown jewel. Rector Murphy buried himself in books that smelled of fresh leather. Dean O'Brien galloped his black stallion across the prairie like a lord surveying his kingdom. But when rumors drifted in from Chicago that a Vatican inspector was traveling, incognito across the Midwest, their swagger curdled into unease. James noticed it immediately. The priests began whispering behind locked doors, sending McManus into town more frequently, burning papers in the furnace that filled the halls with the bitter tang of ash. Their confidence, once terrifying, now betrayed a hairline fracture. The first time, James dared to hope. The arrival Bishop Montini arrived unannounced on a raw March morning, the prairie still crusted with snow. He rode not in a bishop's carriage but in a simple wagon driven by a farmer, his black cloak dusted with road salt. He was a small man, wiry, his eyes sharp and restless, like a hawk surveying a field. When Walsh greeted him at the gate with rehearsed warmth, Montini did not smile. He stepped past the priest with barely a nod, his gaze lingering on the seminary walls as if listening to their whispers. Inside the chapel, Montini's voice carried no grandeur. It was clipped, precise. "I will see the students. Alone, the Tsar." 3 priests stiffened, exchanging glances. Walsh attempted charm. "Excellency, surely you would prefer to speak with us first. The boys are impressionable, prone to—" Montini raised a hand. "The boys," he said, "will tell me what the walls cannot." And just like that, the balance of power shifted. A dangerous ally, James, was the 3rd student called to Montini's private chamber. He entered with his heart pounding, uncertain if the bishop was truly an ally or another figure of authority ready to dismiss him into silence. Montini studied him with an intensity that stripped away pretense. "You are O'Malley," he said. Not a question. "Yes, Excellency. You sent me a letter," cleverly worded. The bishop leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Tell me, without embellishment, what is happening here?" James hesitated. One wrong word, one misplaced detail, and the bishop might dismiss him as paranoid. Or worse, Montini might already be compromised. But then James saw something in the man's eyes. Not skepticism, but readiness. As though he had been waiting for this very moment. So James told him everything. The disappearances, the coded letters, the wagons at night, the underground chambers filled with clothing and ledgers. The moment Walsh had offered him complicity in exchange for silence, Montini listened without interruption, his face a mask of stone. Only when James finished did he exhale, slow and deliberate. "You have done well," he said. "And you are. Correct, their priesthood is a fiction." James blinked. "You know who they are?" "Not yet," Montini admitted. but Rome's records do not list them, and my wires to Dublin confirm 3 real priests by those names were lost at sea. What walks here in their stead are impostors. James felt the air shift around him. Confirmation, at last. But, Montini added, his voice sharpening, proof must be gathered carefully. If we act too soon, they will scatter like rats, leaving nothing but graves. If we act too late— He let the silence finish the thought. James swallowed. So what do we do? Montini's eyes gleamed. We set a trap. And you, O'Malley, will help me bait it. The investigation begins. Montini moved quickly, cloaking his intentions behind the appearance of ordinary inspection. He requested financial ledgers, questioned the priests about curriculum, inspected the chapel's architecture with polite but cutting remarks. Walsh played the role of wounded dignitary, his voice dripping with false humility. Excellency, surely our success speaks for itself. The young men thrive. Their discipline is unmatched. Our donors are most pleased. Murphy hovered with ledgers, offering elaborate explanations for income and expenditures that Montini punctured with quiet precision. O'Brien maintained a smiling mask but gripped the edge of his chair so hard his knuckles whitened. To the students, Montini's presence was electric. For months they had lived in fear, whispering suspicions in shadow. Now, a figure from Rome, himself walked their halls asking questions the priests had forbidden. For the first time, hope spread like a spark across dry kindling. But hope was dangerous. It made people bold, and boldness could be fatal. McManus. Breaks late, one night, as James crept toward the basement chambers to guide Montini to the hidden records. He found someone waiting, Brother McManus. The lay brother's lantern trembled in his hand, casting wild shadows across his gaunt face. His eyes darted toward the chapel doors, then back to James. They'll kill you, McManus hissed. His voice was raw, frayed by years of fear. They killed the others, and they'll kill you. Don't think Montini can stop them. He doesn't know what they've done. James froze. Then tell me, what have you seen? McManus's hands shook so violently the lantern clattered against the stone. I've buried them, he whispered. 17 of them. Dug the holes with my own hands while Walsh watched. If I refused, I'd be in the ground too. James felt his stomach lurch. The brother wasn't just complicit, he was enslaved, trapped in fear. Then help us stop them, James urged. Show us where. But McManus's face twisted in terror. No, I can't. They're watching even now. The walls, they hear everything. Before James could press further, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Walsh's voice boomed. Brother! McManus's eyes went wide. He shoved the lantern into James's hands and fled into the darkness, his sobs echoing off the stone. James stood trembling, the bishop's trap suddenly more perilous than ever. The turning of the crowd Montini escalated his tactics. During Mass, he delivered a homily not on theology, but on corruption. There are wolves, he said, his voice resonant, who cloak themselves in holy garments to feast upon the flock. Wolves who speak with silver tongues, who build walls, not to shelter but to conceal. God sees them, and he will not be mocked. The students shifted in their pews, eyes darting toward Walsh and his cohorts. The priests remained outwardly calm, but James could feel the tension tightening like a noose. That night, Walsh summoned the students. His face was pale with fury, his words venomous. The bishop's words are tests. He seeks to sow division. And any who question our authority are not sons of God, but serpents in his garden. Remember that. The message was clear. Montini's presence was dangerous. Align with him, and you risked vanishing. James lay awake that night, the bishop's words warring with Walsh's threats. Between them, the walls seemed to whisper, as if the stones themselves held the weight of the murdered. The trap is sprung. 2 weeks later, Montini set his plan in motion. He declared he would conduct an unannounced midnight inspection of the seminary, grounds including the basements. His reasoning was simple. The truth of a house is found not in its halls but in its foundations. The priests objected violently. Walsh thundered about sacrilege. Murphy muttered about procedural impropriety. O'Brien slammed his fist on the table. But Montini's authority was absolute. They had no choice but to comply. That night, lanterns flickered as Montini, accompanied by James, descended into the cold stone belly of Sacred Heart. The air was damp, metallic, carrying the faint smell of earth freshly turned. Montini moved with quiet certainty, inspecting chambers, demanding keys, questioning every locked door. When Walsh attempted to deflect, "This area is for storage only," Montini replied. "Then let us see what you store." Finally, Montini stopped before a chamber James had never dared to enter. Its door was iron-banded, its key heavy in Walsh's trembling hand. "Open it," Montini commanded. Walsh hesitated. For the first time, his mask cracked. Not anger, but fear. And in that hesitation, James felt the air grow colder, the walls lean inward, as though the building itself anticipated the revelation to come. Walsh placed the key in the lock, turned. The iron groaned. The door swung open. Inside lay rows of crates, each stenciled with numbers. The smell hit them first, earth and rot, mingled with candle wax. Montini raised his lantern, and there, stacked neatly atop the crates, were bones. Human bones cleaned and arranged with chilling precision. James staggered backward, bile rising. Montini's face was carved from stone, but his knuckles whitened around the lantern's handle. Walsh exhaled, a strange, almost relieved sound. "Now you see," he murmured. "Now you understand." And from the darkness deeper in the chamber, a voice answered. Not Walsh, not Murphy, not O'Brien. Another voice, low and mocking. "You've come too late, Bishop." The lantern light quivered as a figure stepped forward from the shadows. The men without names, the iron door groaned wider, spilling the lantern light deeper into the chamber. Bones glistened in the flicker, skulls stacked like forbidden relics, ribs bound with twine, femurs piled as if they were cordwood. The air was thick with the metallic tang of soil freshly disturbed, as if the earth itself had been exhaling the dead. And then came the voice. Low, amused, spoken with the confidence of a man who had long stopped fearing discovery. "You've come too late, Bishop." From behind the crate stepped a figure James had never seen before. Gaunt, his hair slicked back, his cassock stained as though it had been dredged from the grave. His eyes, wide, restless, glimmered like those of a starving animal. He moved, with a twitchy energy, a shadow that had detached itself from its master. Montini raised the lantern higher, his jaw tightening. "And who are you?" The man grinned, revealing teeth darkened at the edges. "A friend to those who built this place, the grave digger of your precious sons, the one who cleans what the others dirty. McManus." James gasped. The nervous lay, brother who had always skulked at the priest's heels, fetching water, carrying wood, whispering excuses. But this was no trembling servant. This was something else entirely. Walsh stepped forward, his mask of sorrowful dignity collapsing into something harsher, sharper. His voice slipped into an accent thicker than peat bogs, rough Dublin streets bleeding through every syllable. "You've pride enough, Bishop. You think Rome protects you, but out here the prairie belongs to us. These bones," he gestured toward the stacked remains, "are only the ones we could not sell." James felt his knees weaken. Montini, however, stood motionless, his face carved in defiance. "You masquerade as priests," the bishop said softly. "Yet you deal in flesh as if souls were cattle." Murphy gave a humorless laugh. "Cattle fetch less. Identities unveiled." It was O'Brien who delivered the truth, his voice cold as the winter wind. "You still call us priests, Bishop? We were never ordained. We took the names from men who never made it to these shores. The sea took them. We took their lives, their letters, their vestments, and with them, a fortune." He leaned closer to Montini, his breath sour with wine. "Seamus McKenna," he said, tapping Walsh's chest. "The man your records will never name as Father Superior. Liam Doherty." He pointed to Murphy, who adjusted his gold spectacles with twitching fingers. "Our forger and treasurer. And me? Fergus Lynch. I carry the weight when others need silencing." His eyes lingered on James, and for a moment, James felt the weight of every disappearance crash upon his shoulders. 17 boys, vanished into the maw of profit. Montini tightened his grip on the lantern. "And McManus?" Walsh smirked. "Francis? He was a thief we found starving in Cork. We brought him across to dig, to bury, to cower. And he did it well, didn't you, lad?" McManus flinched at the name, his bravado flickering. He swallowed, eyes darting. "I only did what I was told." James realized then that the man was both executioner and victim. Complicit, but chained, trapped in their orbit for too many years. The negotiation, Montini's voice was iron. "You will stand trial. Rome will see you hang." Walsh barked a laugh. "Rome? Out here, Rome is 4,000 miles of ocean away, but our buyers? They are a day's ride. Do you see the difference?" Murphy stepped forward, holding out a ledger fat with parchment. "You want proof? You'll have it. We've kept records of every boy, every price, every buyer, but we don't give away treasure for free. Walk away, Bishop, and we let you take your righteous fury back to Rome. Stay, and you'll join the bones." James's heart thundered. For a moment he thought Montini might retreat, but the bishop's next words were soft daggers. "Every tyrant thinks his empire eternal, and every tyrant forgets that the smallest crack brings down the wall." He turned to James. "Memorize everything you see. Every name. Every place. Truth survives even if men do not." The priests stiffened. Lynch's hand slid beneath his cassock. James glimpsed the dull gleam of a knife. Montini raised the lantern, higher, its flame flaring. "Choose wisely," he said. "Your power is ending." The student's terror. That night James could not sleep. The confrontation in the bone chamber replayed in his mind on an endless loop. He saw the smirk on Walsh's face, the gleam of Murphy's spectacles, the raw hunger in Lynch's eyes. He smelled the dirt that had clung to McManus's lantern. But, above all, he felt the crushing knowledge. They knew. The priests now understood Montini, and James had uncovered the truth. Their masks had been dropped. What came next would not be threats wrapped in theology. It would be survival. James lay awake, clutching his rosary until his knuckles ached, waiting for the creak of footsteps outside his dormitory door. At 2 in the morning the sound came, slow, deliberate. 3 sets of boots stopping outside his room. A pause, then the shuffle of departure, a warning. He whispered a prayer not for himself but for the boys who had already been dragged into the darkness. The town hears Montini, refusing to yield, brought the fight beyond the seminary walls. On Sunday, he traveled to St. Patrick's in Millfield and preached before a packed parish. His words cut through incense like steel. 17 young men, promised to God, are gone. Their names erased, their belongings scattered like dust. And I tell you, this, Sacred Heart is not a house of God, but a market of death. Wolves wear cassocks and their teeth drip with the blood of your sons. The church erupted in murmurs. Mothers clutched rosaries tighter. Fathers clenched fists. Samuel Morrison, the farmer who had found belongings along his fence, shouted aloud, "I knew it. I told you the wagons carried more than grain." The ripple spread like wildfire. By nightfall, Millfield's taverns buzzed with talk of false priests and buried bones. For the first time, the townsfolk began to look toward the seminary not with reverence but with suspicion, and suspicion, once born, is impossible to silence. The priests strike back. Walsh acted swiftly. The very next morning, a proclamation appeared nailed to the seminary's gates. Written in Murphy's hand, it denounced Montini as a heretic sent by Protestants to dismantle Catholic institutions. It declared the bishop's sermons blasphemy, his motives political. Students were gathered in the chapel and warned, "If you speak with the bishop again, you betray your vows. You betray God himself." James watched as fear washed over his peers. Some clung to Montini's courage, others to Walsh's intimidation. Division fractured the dormitories. Suspicion now turned inward. That night, Montini confided in James, "They will not surrender quietly. And if Rome's messengers are intercepted, our proof dies with us." James asked the question he had been dreading. "What do we do?" Montini's answer was steady. "We outlast them. Dawn is coming, O'Malley, but we must survive the night." Survival proved harder than either expected. On the evening of March 19th, as wind lashed the prairie and rain beat against the seminary walls, James sat in the library transcribing the ledgers Montini had uncovered. The air smelled of wet earth and candle smoke. Outside, the storm swallowed all other sound. Then the lantern guttered. The hairs on James's arms prickled. From the corner of the library he heard breathing, slow, heavy. He turned, and in the dim, wavering light saw Lynch standing between the shelves, his knife catching a glint of flame. "Time's up, boy," Lynch whispered. The storm of ashes, the knife gleamed in the sputtering lantern light. James froze, the quill still in his hand, ink dripping onto the ledger. Lynch grinned, his teeth wolfish in the dim glow. "You should have stayed blind, boy. Curiosity doesn't suit your kind." The storm outside roared like a living thing. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the stained glass windows. Shadows shivered across the library walls, throwing Lynch's hulking figure into grotesque proportions. The storm had come as camouflage, a cloak to hide what the false priest planned to do. James bolted. Ink splattered across the ledger as he shoved the table forward, toppling it into Lynch's path. The older man cursed, stumbling, his knife flashing. James darted between shelves, his breath ragged, heart hammering like a war drum. Behind him came the scrape of boots, the hiss of steel through damp air. The hunt. The library was a maze of towering shelves and forgotten alcoves. But James knew its rhythm. He had spent countless nights studying beneath its arches. He ducked low, weaving between stacks, the storm's howls outside masking the sound of his footfalls. But Lynch was no ordinary pursuer. He moved like a predator, patient and deliberate. James could hear the man's breathing, steady, confident, as if he relished the hunt. "Do you know how many lads cried when I dragged them out these very doors?" Lynch called, his voice carrying in the storm-split silence. "You'll scream the same, makes no difference." James pressed himself against the cold stone of a column, forcing air slowly into his lungs. His fingers brushed the edge of the silver rosary in his pocket, the one he'd taken from Michael Brennan's belongings. He clutched it, whispering a silent plea. "Not yet, Lord. Not like this." A flicker of light caught his eye. A side door, usually locked, hung ajar. Candlelight trembled beyond it. The chapel of shadows. James slipped through and found himself in a side chapel, its altar draped in black cloth. Statues of saints loomed in half-light, their eyes hollow, their plaster faces streaked with water from the leaky roof. The air smelled of mildew and old incense, and each drop of rain that slipped through the cracks echoed like a drumbeat in the chamber. And then, the bell. It tolled once, twice, though no hand touched the rope. A deep resonant clang that rolled through the stone. James's blood froze. Was it the storm, or something else? Behind him, the chapel door slammed open. Lynch entered, knife in hand, eyes glittering. "This place makes cowards think God is watching," he sneered. But God turned his back long ago. He lunged. James ducked beneath the altar rail, scrambling across the cold flagstones. His palms scraped against grit. He grabbed blindly, fingers closing around a heavy brass candlestick. When Lynch lunged, again James swung with every ounce of desperation. The candlestick cracked against the man's forearm. The knife clattered across the floor, skidding beneath the pews. For a heartbeat, silence. Then Lynch roared, the sound animal, unholy. Montini's defiance. Elsewhere in the seminary, Bishop Montini was facing his own storm. Walsh and Murphy had cornered him in the refectory, the long dining tables eerily empty, candle flames bowing. under drafts that howled through the cracks. "You've stirred the townsfolk," Walsh said, his cultured accent slipping back into the guttural snarl of Dublin's alleys. "But mobs are like weather, loud then gone. By morning we'll silence them." Montini stood tall, his black cassock whipping in the storm winds that leaked through shattered panes. His voice carried the weight of Rome itself. "You are men without names, parasites wearing holy cloth. You will not silence me." Murphy slid forward, spectacles glinting, ledger clutched under his arm. "No? Then we'll silence the boy. His blood will stain your conscience deeper than ours." Montini's hands curled into fists. "If one drop of that boy's blood is spilled, the prairie itself will rise against you." Walsh smiled thinly. "Then let the prairie bury us all." The lightning struck back in the chapel. James scrambled toward the pews, his chest burning, lungs aching. He reached for the knife, but Lynch was faster. The older man tackled him, slamming James's head against the floor. Sparks of light burst across his vision. The storm outside roared louder, as if urging the violence onward. Lightning split the stained glass window, casting the chapel in a blaze of red and blue. For a single instant, the painted saints seemed alive, faces twisted not in serenity but in horror. James twisted beneath Lynch's weight, shoving upward with his knees. He felt ribs crack, his or Lynch's, he couldn't tell. The knife gleamed, again raised high, and then the bell tolled once more, a deafening clang that shook dust from the rafters. Lynch hesitated, eyes flicking upward, and in that heartbeat, James drove the brass candlestick into his jaw with every ounce of desperation. Bone crunched, blood sprayed, Lynch collapsed sideways, groaning, the knife slipping from his grasp. James staggered to his feet, clutching the weapon at last, but as he turned, the chapel doors were filled with shadows. Walsh, Murphy, and McManus, lantern in hand, his eyes unreadable. The last bargain. "You've got fire in you, boy," Walsh said, his voice half admiration, half threat. "But fire burns out. Give us the ledger and you walk away. Rome doesn't need martyrs. It needs silence." James's hands shook as he held the knife. He could feel the weight of Michael's rosary in his pocket, could hear the echo of his lost classmates' laughter in the halls. Montini appeared then, drenched from the storm, his lantern blazing. He stepped between James and the false priests. "You call yourselves merchants," Montini said, his voice iron. "But you are nothing more than gravediggers of souls. You have profited from silence. Tonight silence ends." Walsh's eyes narrowed. "Then tonight, Bishop, so do you." Thunder rolled, shaking the stones. The wind howled through shattered glass. And in that suspended moment, three forces stood locked. The boy with his knife, the bishop with his defiance, and the false priests with their hunger for power. The storm raged, demanding blood, and then, as if answering the storm itself, the front doors of the seminary exploded inward. Dozens of figures poured in, lanterns held high, rifles gleaming, farmers, townsfolk, parishioners of Millfield, faces grim, eyes burning with righteous fury. Samuel Morrison at the front, his shotgun leveled. "You'll answer for every boy," Morrison shouted, voice like thunder. The false priests turned, their confidence cracking for the first time. The townsfolk had come, but whether they were in time to save James or too late, hung in the air like the final toll of a cursed bell. The reckoning of Sacred Heart. The storm had broken the prairie wide open. Rain sluiced down in sheets, lightning clawed at the horizon, and thunder rattled the seminary's foundations as though God himself had arrived to pass judgment. The false priests stood frozen at the chapel doors, their silhouettes framed in lantern glow. Beyond them, the townsfolk pressed forward, muskets and shotguns bristling like a forest of steel. Samuel Morrison's voice cut through the storm. "You'll answer for the 17, and for every lie you carved into these walls." Walsh tried, his usual trick, lifting his arms like a prophet before the mob. His voice carried a tragic grandeur, a mask he had worn for 15 years. "Good people, do not be deceived. This is heresy, Protestant lies to turn you against your church. Will you murder priests on holy ground?" But the words fell flat. The crowd had seen too much, heard too many whispers carried on the wind. Mothers in the ET crowd clutched rosaries found along fence lines. Fathers remembered sons who had vanished into silence. A woman's voice, thin but fierce, pierced the night. Priests don't ride wagons at midnight with bound boys in the back. The illusion cracked. The standoff rain streamed down Murphy's spectacles as he pushed forward. Ledger clutched against his chest like a shield. Do you fools know what you're doing? These records are church property. Confidential. You'll damn yourselves if you interfere? Confidential? Morrison spat into the mud. That's what you called my nephew's grave, too? The crowd roared agreement, pressing closer. The smell of wet wool and gunpowder filled the chapel's entryway. James, standing behind Montini, felt the tension coil like a spring ready to snap. One wrong word and the storm outside would spill inside, this holy place baptized not with water but with blood. Montini raised his lantern high, his voice cut through the chaos with the authority of Rome. These men are not priests. They are wolves who murdered clergy at sea, stole their names, and sold your sons as cattle. Their sacraments were empty, their oaths false, their hands steeped in blood. You are not killing priests tonight, you are cutting down liars. The mob surged forward. The breaking point Walsh's mask shattered. His accent dropped fully into the guttural rasp of Dublin's back alleys. Then come and try, you cattle-bred fools. He drew a pistol from beneath his cassock, the steel black as the storm. A shot cracked, the sound deafening in the small chapel. Splinters exploded from the pew beside James. Screams erupted. Farmers ducked, muskets lifted, chaos roared louder than the storm. Lynch, blood still trickling from his jaw, lunged toward the crowd with his knife, slashing wildly. He caught a farmer across the arm, blood and rain mingling. The man fell back, shrieking, and then the gunfire began. Muzzle flashes lit the chapel like hell's own lightning. The air stank of black powder. Glass shattered, statues crumbled. James dropped flat as bullets tore through the air. Above him, Montini still stood, lantern blazing, voice unshaken even as the world fractured. Do not lose yourselves. Justice, not vengeance. But no one could hear him anymore. The collapse. When the smoke cleared, Walsh lay sprawled across the altar, his pistol still in hand, blood blooming through his cassock. Murphy was pinned beneath a shattered pew, his ledger fallen open, ink and rain dissolving years of criminal records into unreadable stains. Lynch was nowhere to be seen. The townsfolk, panting, soaked, stunned by their own fury, lowered their weapons one by one. Montini stepped forward, checking Walsh's pulse. His hand came away wet, red. He shook his head. Dead. Morrison spat again. Better him than another boy. But James noticed something. Walsh's other hand, clenched, tight around something hidden. He pried the fingers open and found not a rosary but a brass key, heavy and ornate. What's this? James asked. Montini's eyes darkened. The key to where the rest are buried. The hidden crypt guided by McManus, who trembled now like a leaf in the storm. The mob followed Montini and James into the deepest tunnels beneath the seminary. The air grew colder with every step, the walls dripping with groundwater, the ceiling low enough that taller men stooped. At last they reached a door of iron, chained and bolted. The key fit perfectly. The hinges shrieked as the door opened. Inside lay a chamber vast as a cathedral's nave, carved secretly beneath the prairie. Rows of rough coffins lined the walls, stacked 3 high. Candles burned at intervals, their flames steady despite the storm above. 17 coffins stood open, empty. The crowd gasped. Mothers wept. Fathers cursed. James felt his blood turn to ice. Where are they? He whispered. McManus answered, voice broken. Sold. Everyone. Only the ones who resisted. Only they stayed here. He gestured to the far corner, where 7 coffins were sealed shut. Montini pressed a hand to the wood. He did not open them. He only whispered, Requiem aeternam. The crowd joined, voices trembling. The sound echoed like a dirge through the crypt, a hymn for boys whose names would never fade again. The twist, But as the prayer faded, James noticed something strange. One coffin was newer, its wood unstained by years of damp, its nails fresh, its lid flush. He frowned. "Bishop, this one." Montini helped pry it open. The lid groaned. Inside lay not a body, but papers, hundreds of them, neatly tied. Ledgers, contracts, letters of sale, proof. James lifted a sheet, the ink smudged but legible. Names of buyers in Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin. Names of victims beyond the Seminary's 17. Scores more, perhaps hundreds. "This isn't just Sacred Heart," James whispered. "It's a network." Montini's jaw set. "And the head of it still breathes, because Lynch was gone." The escape back above ground. Dawn had begun to break. The storm was moving east, leaving the prairie soaked in silver under the rising sun. The mob dispersed slowly, carrying the wounded, comforting the grieving. But James knew one truth. Fergus Lynch had fled into the storm's cover. Somewhere on foot or on stolen horse, he carried the last secrets of Sacred Heart and the will to keep the trade alive. Montini turned to James, laying a hand on his shoulder. "You must carry this to Rome. These records will burn their disguises, away forever. But the hunt is not finished." James nodded, clutching the bundle of damp papers. He could feel the weight of every missing boy pressing against his chest. The land remembers. Sacred Heart Seminary was shuttered within weeks. The great brick structure stood silent, windows shattered, roof sagging, until it was finally torn down, decades later. Farmers who plowed its fields swore they heard wagon wheels in the night or bells tolling with no tower to hold them. 17 boys had vanished within those walls. Only bones and names remained. James O'Malley carried the records to Rome. But the story never fully reached the light. Some files were sealed, marked forbidden. Some buyers, men of power, were never named. And Fergus Lynch? His trail twisted through the Midwest like smoke. Some said he died in the mines, others that he sailed back to Ireland under another stolen name, but the land remembered. Every spring, when storms broke the prairie wide open, townsfolk near the old seminary swore they heard a bell tolling underground. And with it, voices, young men calling, not in Latin prayer, but in terror. Final twist years later, long after Montini had returned to Rome and James had become a federal marshal, a farmer digging a well less than a mile from the seminary uncovered a wooden box sealed with iron. Inside were priestly vestments, blood-stained, water-worn, and a letter in a careful hand. It was addressed to the next keeper. The words chilled all who read them. Sacred Heart was but one. The others remain. When the soil grows hungry, you will know where to sow. The signature was simple. F. The network had never ended, and perhaps somewhere in the rolling hills of Illinois, it still waits. So there you have it, the story of Sacred Heart Seminary. 17 young men vanished, their fates twisted into profit, their voices silenced by impostors who wore the garments of faith. The storm tore their secrets open, but some shadows remain unbroken even today. What do you think? Was Fergus Lynch killed by the storm? Or did he live on to plant more seminaries across the Midwest? And how many of those records sealed in Rome still hide the truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story left your heart pounding like mine, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another tale from the darkest corners of American history. Because some stories don't stay buried,